Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Vampires. I was contacted not that long ago by, this is his time and duration to judge, in my view, not that long ago, by a gentleman by the name of CT Phipps, Charles Phipps. He's a prolific author. You can actually find all of his work online. It's worth checking out. Now, CT was very kind enough to pick up a physical copy of The World Below, which, as you know by now, if you buy a physical copy of The World Below, you get to request a video of your choosing. Not only that, but CT Phipps also happened to interview me for Grimdark magazine about The World Below at that time. Now, what video did CT Phipps request? Well, you're looking at it, and I imagine you've already read the title, but in case you haven't, it's this. He wanted a video focusing on the Kindred of Gary, Indiana. Now, this is something of a pet interest of CT's because I have been familiar with him for several years now, at least since when I was working on V5, maybe before. And I know that he has, and I say this with no judgment at all, something of a... of an unhealthy fixation, a parasocial relationship, a morbid interest. No, let's be kinder. A real fandom for the Kindred of Gary, Indiana. The ones introduced in Forged in Steel, and Blood at Dawn, I think, is the other one from the first edition products for Vampire the Masquerade. He loves these characters, especially the characters Alysia and Evelyn, I believe. He is often attracted to the strong feminine characters in Vampire the Masquerade. And all credit to you, Charles, for wearing your adoration for such characters on your sleeve. Now, he wanted me to make a video about the Kindred of Gary, Indiana, and that's a broad subject. So the way I decided to approach it was how these characters function as archetypes for Vampire the Masquerade. Let me explain. You see, these were the very first statted kindred for Vampire the Masquerade. Before Chicago by Night, before Milwaukee by Night, before the other by Nights, you had Forged in Steel, the very first, the starter chronicle for Vampire the Masquerade. And it introduced the city of Gary, Indiana, an urban wasteland city on the Rust Belt, falling into degradation, with a dusty prince clinging onto former glories, an anarch baron who wasn't really up to much, some confused children or child are being used as pawns, some hoary old elders who really could give a shit. Oh god, that's an American way of saying it, isn't it? They couldn't give a shit about the political element of Gary and Chicago, and a couple of wild cards out there as well, along with perennial vampire hunter Sullivan Dayne. And they became archetypal for the simple reason that they are the first. But where they are archetypal is of extreme interest to me. Because when I was digging back through these characters, their histories, where they've popped up in Vampire the Masquerade, I realised that although we as fans of the World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade have certain expectations in our mind for how various vampire clans might behave and their stereotypes may behave, archetypes and stereotypes are two very different things. And some of the Gary, Indiana kindred do act as stereotypes, though they weren't such at beginning, and others are more archetypal in theme. What do I mean by this? So, Gary, Indiana, as first presented, has Modius, the prince of the city. And what a city to be prince of. Modius is a fallen icon. He is a monarch without a throne. He is a vampire without much influence or power. He is a figure of ridicule. He is very much in the shadow of Prince Lodin of Chicago, if he is your prince at the time of running. And there isn't really much to respect about Modius. He seems to be something of a joke, all told. He has this rather convoluted story, backstory, of course, as many kindred do, of his coming to America, of his life through slavery, the American Civil War, and so forth. Ultimately, he becomes the Prince of Gary, Indiana, and for a time, that probably feels like a big deal, and then Gary disappears off the map. It's no longer a significant political interest in America Loads of the mortals move away. He is now king of the rubble. It would be so easy to paint him as a Ventrue, wouldn't it? Have him as an aged Ventrue. A Ventrue who believes he is a king, but he is the king of nothing but dust. But the interesting thing about Modius is he is a Toreador. And he shows us a good archetype for Toreador obsession. He is obsessed with authority. He is obsessed with clinging on to the power that he has hold of. He's obsessed with reputation. And yet he is allowing all of these things to slip through his fingers constantly. In fact, he's not even allowing it. He has no choice but to do it. And from archetype standpoint, he is a vampire who is lost in time. His time was a century ago. He is now a relic. And his clan is somewhat immaterial, but I would suggest that he is a really interesting figurehead for the first Toreador we get to see in Vampire the Masquerade. Pair him with a child, Alysia, who is a selectively mute Toreador who does certainly lean more toward the artistic side, the flapper side, the fashionable side. You could argue she is something of a muse to Modius, someone meant to invigorate him, stimulate his obsessions and his attractions to beautiful things. Again, he is a Toreador. But in that respect, Alysia fulfills a different side of the Toreador coin. You have Modius, who is all about obsession and clinging on to history. You've got Alysia, who is more about the now, about vogue, but she has no way of communicating it or conveying her will because she is so much Modius's puppet. But naturally, a lot of players, when they play things like Forge and Steel, are going to want to try and sever that blood bond, free her from her sire. And I know that there's plenty of people that do approach Forge and Steel with Alysia being the sort of damsel in distress vampire who needs saving from a cruel master. On the other side of that, you have the Brujar of the domain. You've got Juggler, who is the Anarch Baron, an excellent name for a somewhat chaotic, anarchic Baron of the Anarch movement. And where he is archetypal is both in... It helps define exactly what the Anarch movement becomes outside of the core book. Because the Anarchs, for years, until I would suggest Anarchs Unbound for V20, were a joke. They were almost always, outside of some representatives in LA by Night, by that I mean the source book, not the actual play, Los Angeles by Night, they're a joke. They're failures. And Juggler is the first Anarch failure that we get to meet in Vampire the Masquerade. He is a Baron, much like Modius, over the ashes. He has a long rivalry with Modius. He is a Brujar, so he's always fighting against authority. But where he is archetypal is he is the archetypal Anarch who wants to decapitate the leadership and has nothing good to replace it. He will still be Baron of the Ashes. He will still be ruler over nothing. But he thinks, well, it's got to be better than what we've got going on right now. And so again, Juggler, much like Modius, they're both supposed to be two of the same kind of character. One claims to be autocracy, one claims to be more liberal, but ultimately they both want to rule and they have nothing to effectively rule over. That paints a very vivid picture of the Anarchs. It paints a very vivid picture of the Brujar as well. But then you have Juggler's child in the form of Evelyn. And Evelyn, unlike Alysia, is a lot more fiery. She has been embraced to kind of be the revolutionary successor to Juggler from my perspective. He is her tool, her toy, his vessel, I should say, for all of his inspiration, all of his ideas. It's only until we get further into Vampire the Masquerade's lore that Evelyn ends up becoming the Baron of Gary and basically surpassing her sire, actually doing something with it. And that puts her in an interesting Brujar position. You have Juggler as the ineffective Brujar that's just tilting at windmills, and you've got Evelyn as the Brujar who sees power, decapitates it, and replaces it. Whether her method will succeed with characters like Eric Sharp and Maxwell and so on in the wings, as we introduced in V5, is yet to be seen. Will we ever revisit Gary? well, I don't know. When I say we, I'm not going to be. I'm not working on these books and haven't been for some time. But it's an interesting dichotomy going on there with the 2 Toreador and the 2 Bruja. And floating around in the ether, you have your elders. You've got a Nosferatu in the form of Alexander Danov, and you have a Malkavian, not Malkavian, sorry, he is around, but we've got the Gangrel, Lucien. And Danov is an interesting Nosferatu, again, when we're looking, and I'm going to keep using this word, at archetypes. Archetypes are different from stereotypes. When we think of Nosferatu, we think of festering ill, rats, sewers, disease, putrid. Danov is wise. He is in communication with the inconnu. He is very much distinct from the city politics of Gary. He doesn't have much to do with what's going on. In fact, I'd say he's pretty aloof from the plot in general. There are a few reasons why you would involve yourself with Danov and he would involve himself with you. So this isn't a Nosferatu head of a spy network. Oh, he watches people. He may even have an interest in them, like a monitor for the inconnu would, but he doesn't necessarily act on any of those interests. And that is an interesting place to put Nosferatu. And on the other side of that, you've got the elder Gangrel, Lucien. And this was a time when Gangrel were not being put out there as Wolverine. They weren't all hairy, feral, angry Bruja, hairy Bruja. Rather, many of them, and I would say that this goes all the way through Chicago by Night and Milwaukee by Night, many Gangrel are put in as noble savages and noble warriors and the like. And Lucien is a vampire who was embraced at the time of Julius Caesar. He was a Roman that served under Caesar, and he again holds himself aloof from city politics. The role Danov and Lucien can play in a chronicle is an intriguing one, because while they're not going to be too bothered about whether it's the Camarilla or the Anarchs or indeed anyone else who's dominant in the domain, the fact that they're even present in a relic like Gary is a good question you could explore. But it's also another aspect of Vampire the Masquerade. You've got the political vampires, and then you've got the vampires who are more tied to things like tradition and age and clan. And we know from later books that Lucien is quite tightly tied to the Gangrel goings-on in Chicago, but again, pretty absent of politics. Then floating around in the middle, the wild card, you have your Malkavian, Michael. And Michael is the least well-drawn of all of the characters presented in Gary, Indiana. He is deeply disturbed. He is quite innocent with it, but he is dangerous. He could do anything, go anywhere, harm anyone, help anyone. And he is a character who is likely to fall afoul of player aggravation or the NPC's aggravation. He's in some way going to play victim to the, workings of Gary, Indiana Kindred. He's not going to come out on top, and he's not really suited to try. So that, I would suggest, out of all of them, is probably the most threadbare vampire, Michael, and it's no wonder he doesn't really appear in any future books. He's kind of a paper-thin concept. This is just the random vampire. What's he going to do? Well, maybe your player characters are going to earn him as an ally. Maybe they're going to antagonize him and he's going to become a rival. And that's fine. Those characters are needed as well. But in that respect, he is the one that's least that's least like an archetype. He's more like just a paper-thin concept, and use him as you will. And as I say, it also introduces Sullivan Dayne, the very first vampire hunter that appeared in Vampire the Masquerade, with his rather bizarre art, if you examine it, and his amazing track record of slaying Kindred without mercy. Sullivan Dayne is another character who I've really enjoyed revisiting in Vampire the Masquerade. I've introduced him in subsequent books, or reintroduced him in subsequent books. And I vaguely remember him having a good card for Vampire the Eternal Struggle. But he is a solitary man, just a very, very capable mortal who knows a lot about Kindred. This is not an ill-informed member of the Second Inquisition. This is a guy like an exorcist, like a well-trained vampire hunter, like a Van Helsing, who knows exactly what he's doing and where the enemy is. And so when I wrote, what was it, Rusted Veins, for the V5 playtest. This was the good playtest. I made sure Solomon Dayne actually appeared in it, and I'm glad he did. I think in most of the endings he gets blown up by the end of it, taking out Modius, but how you run it is entirely up to you. Anyway, I'm really glad CT asked me to look into these characters again, because it's been so long since I've really considered the vampires of Gary, Indiana, as players on the vampire stage. When Vampire the Masquerade got bigger and bigger and the meta plot became more and more sprawling, but at the same time all-encompassing, characters with little political significance like the ones in Gary, Indiana can feel like throwaway, we don't need them. But where they are most interesting to me is as cornerstones for the setting, establishing what the sects are like, what the clans are like, what individual vampires can be like, and what their structure is was not really reflected in future books outside of the Bruges-Toreador conflict in Gary being reflected in Chicago, with a Bruges and a Toreador Methuselah going at it. That was interesting, that the Ventrue didn't really come into their own, I would suggest, until Milwaukee by Night. That's not to say Loden isn't an important character in Chicago by Night by any means, but I guess the jihad, the power play in the background is still very much Bruges versus Toreador in Chicago. And then come Milwaukee by Night, the plot is all about the Ventrue prince has been murdered. He has two Ventrue childer who are competing for his praxis, and so on. Anyway, I'm really happy you asked me to look into that, CT. I hope that's been interesting. And what I would love to hear from you folks in the comments is which characters in the Vampire the Masquerade canon have you really enjoyed reading about? Have you used in your games? Have you found inspirational for your characters? That would interest me, and I'd love for you to comment below with your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching, and I will be seeing you next time.